Hello and welcome to the Underhive. We are back with some more How to Command the Death Guard. In this series, we're going to take a look at every aspect of the Death Guard, so whether you're looking to get more out of your army, or you're thinking of joining Nurgle's finest, then there's something here for you. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the Warzone Nephilim secondary missions, as you may have seen from the thumbnail and title. So let's dive in and take a look at the secondaries for Death Guard. Now, just as an overview, I will say I don't think there's anything wrong with going with all three of them. Despoiled Grounds is probably the weakest, and we'll start with that. But, particularly if you're new to Nephilim, or just new to the game generally, I don't think you can go wrong taking all three, and then once you get acclimatized to how you want to play and whether Despoiled Ground is something you feel is achievable for your list consistently, you may well want to swap that out. Fleeing Vectors is more specific to your opponent because it's based on killing models and failing morale. So infantry units are going to be the prime target for that because they have multiple models in the unit and therefore they can fail morale. A heavy vehicle list, like, if you came up against like Iron Hands Dreadnought spam, then you probably aren't going to want Fleeing Vectors as heavily. Spread the Sickness is an action and very easy to track and do, completes on your own turn, so it's not interactable by the opponent, and it's the only action that Poxwalkers can complete. So it's probably an auto take, Spread the Sickness. Despoiled Ground scores at the end of the game. So my reason for recommending it for a newer player is that you don't need to track it throughout the game, it's one less thing to remember going on. Now, you do need to bear it in mind from probably turn 3 onwards. Depending on your list, you might be very low on mobility. The infantry, particularly for Death Guard, are slow, that's their shtick. But there are some faster units in the list. If you're running Mortarion and he's still healthy, he's got great movement and fly. Fetid bloat drones are very, very good for some of the other for Fleeing Vectors as well. So if you throw in some of them in the list, they can be great for scoring Despoiled Grounds at the end of the game, once they've already done their job of killing infantry. So overall, whilst the army does have a lot of slow units that are central to any typical list, there are also some very fast units that are going to be able to go out and score this at the end of the game. So there are 5 bullet points here that you can score on, and you get 3 victory points for each of them to total a maximum 15. So you get 3 points for 1 or more Death Guard units in your own, wholly within your own deployment zone, and 1 or more Death Guard units wholly within the opponent deployment zone. Now this is probably the most difficult. However, you have got, as we've said, we have got faster units that can fly in the form of the Bloat Drone and Mortarion. You have got faster units on the ground like Blight Haulers. The Plague Burst Crawlers aren't slow if they're on the top bracket, but given their profile, the range on their weapons, they're likely to be the one in your deployment zone. Doing the one in your deployment zone is very, very easy because, of course, you might just have a squad of Poxwalkers sat on your home objective to do a Spread the Sickness at some point in the game. So getting the one in yours is very, very easy. Getting the one in the opponent's is quite difficult. You could strike in with Terminators, but I would encourage you to not take the bait of striking into the back corner. An experienced opponent will leave you a back corner because they know they can outrun you. Most armies are going to have a 6-inch movement on their infantry, if not more. There's a lot of advanced shenanigans as well for armies, +1 to advance, or reroll advance, or auto advance a certain distance, which is going to make it very difficult for you to move up and then try and make a charge to get into them. So I would try and avoid being tempted to go for the back corner. It has worked for me in the past, but not always. It's sometimes a big risk. But what you could do is bring in a smaller squad, say of Death Shroud, 3-man team, 150 points, not a big investment. You can have them off the board till maybe turn 3. But if you feel pressured and that you need them out there killing something, you can still bring them in turn 2 and go, right, I might have to give up the 3 points on being in my opponent's deployment zone. If these fights go well, I can maybe make some advances later and get up to that. The rest are not as difficult. So 1 or more Death Guard units from your army are wholly within 3 table quarters and at least 6 inch into that table quarter. So if we imagine we do a dividing line, you need to be 6 inches away from those dividing lines, and it must be wholly within. So if you start in your half and you're trying to cross that line, you're going to need to hit the line plus 6 inches with every model, which is why I'm saying you need to consider this from turn 3 onwards, because even a good advance on Poxwalkers is, between 8 and 10 inch moving, if you roll between a 4 and a 6. So that in and of itself isn't necessarily enough to get them wholly within another quarter. You might need to do that a turn or two before the end and continue to do it to push up. Again, bear in mind your opponent's got time to interact with that, but Poxwalkers can cheese extra movement. I often like to leave some Poxwalkers, maybe a 15 to 20 squad, out in the open around the central point. Your opponent shoots at them, chips off 10 models, that's fine. In your next command phase, you can bring some back from the dead. You roll 7 dice for 1 CP. On a 3-up, you bring a model back, and you can put them in front of the unit and essentially cheese some extra movement. So that can be a way of scoring it on turn 5, particularly if you go in second. Your opponent might go, right, okay, they're going to try and push up. I know you've got the spoiled grounds. Let's kill a few. If they don't manage it, they may have handed you the keys to score those 3 victory points. There's another 3 on offer if you can get into all 4 table quarters. So realistically, the game plan is to hit 6 by being in all 4 quarters. The next one is you control half or more the total number of objective markers on the battlefield, and there are Death Guard units in range of those objective markers. Now, for most of the missions, you only control them if you're in range of them. So that is one in the same for most missions. But there are missions where the objectives are considered to remain in your control if they were controlled by an objective secured unit. So for us, that's going to be Poxwalkers, Plague Marines, and Terminators. So your Blight Lords and Death Shroud, not your characters. So the fact that we've got 4 great OBSEC units that will form at least some part of a typical list, you might not run all 4 types, but you will run some most of the time, means that you're going to be able to control those objectives, and in some cases, some missions, you'll be able to continue controlling them even if you choose to move off them. If you are taking despoiled ground, you need to bear in mind you'll need to keep something on those objectives to be able to score those points. But again, at the end of the game, a big model like a Plague Burst Crawler on those 6 objective missions can actually slot in between them and get within 3 of both. Same goes, a squad of Poxwalkers can be strung out to go across multiple objectives. That's perfectly fine. The unit doesn't have to be wholly within the objective, so it can tag out across multiple. This isn't an action. You don't need to do something on the objective only once. You can spread across as many of them as you can reach. So that one's not too difficult to achieve. If you can keep a squad of Poxwalkers safe, you can maybe string them between an objective or 2 on your side of the board and use your heavy hitters, your Death Shroud, your Plague Marines, your characters to get up there and score on your opponent's objectives. You only need to hit half, so that's not too difficult. Realistically, that is how you play Nephilim. You want to control half or more for the primary. You want to be on the middle objective for some of the second parts of the primary. You want to be on objectives for a lot of the second part of the primary. You're just playing the game. So to be able to get 3 points for that is at least something. And then the last one is that every objective marker on the battlefield is in contagion range of 1 or more contagion abilities that Death Guard units from your army have. So that is slightly easier than getting on the objective in your wholly within your opponent's deployment zone. But if you manage to be in the deployment zone with a 9-inch contagion range, you may well be able to get the objective in contagion range itself. Now, as far as the wording here, I understand it as the contagion must cover the objective marker, the center of the objective marker, not the contagion is within 3 of the objective, like a unit would need to be to control it. So it's not that generous, but you are at your 9-inch match range. With something like the ability Typhus has, he would have a 12-inch contagion range. You can slap the Chines on the Death Shroud to give them a maximum 12-inch range. You could take Gift of Plagues to extend contagion range. So there are a lot of ways you can manipulate that to be a 12-inch or a 12-inch contagion range, and make it so that a single unit can infect a lot of the board. So overall, as I say, Despoiled Ground, probably the weakest, but not terrible, and it is forcing you to play the game in a way that's conducive to winning on the primary as well. Next up, Fleeing Vectors. So like we said, if you're up against a skew list with no infantry, then it's not going to be a good pick. But as long as there is some amount of infantry, then it can be reasonable. So at the end of each player's turn, so there's no cap to this besides the maximum amount scoreable on it, but it occurs every turn. So you don't necessarily need to worry about scoring it on your turn. You might be willing to let your opponent come in and charge you and get some points there as a result. Particularly with something like a Foul Blight spawn in the list, making your opponent fight last, you can score really well even in your opponent's turn with Fleeing Vectors. So you get 1 point for destroying 7 or more models by attacks made by Death Guard. So you could be using like the Contemptor with Volkites, very good into infantry. The rest of your army is very good into infantry, which is why I'm a bit down on the Contemptor, but I'm not against it as a strategy. I do think it can do very well. So you're quite likely to kill 7 or more models with some Contemptors with Volkite if you're able to target infantry. You would get a point for killing 7 or more models. You would get an additional point if 7 or more models were killed by attacks made by plague weapons. So realistically, anything in melee besides your Poxwalkers, it's going to be plague weapon attacks. So as I've said there, for that aspect, you can quite handily get the 2 points by your opponent looking to trade on an objective. That's a very common aspect of Nephilim. You're on the objective. Your opponent doesn't want you to still control that objective at the start of your next command phase, or the end of your next command phase, but the start of your next turn, because you might then control more and score 12 on the primary. They may be willing to throw up a squad of 10 cheap chaffy troops that have OBSEC to contest that objective and make it so that you don't control it in your command phase, even though you will likely control it again at the end of your turn because it's a cheap chaffy unit up against Blight Lords or Plague Marines, which are very good at dealing with those sorts of units. So they may look to do that. Yes, you might lose out on the primary that turn as a result, but you can then eat up those models with your Plague Weapons and get 2 points for killing at least 7 models with Plague Weapons. And then as well, at the end of each of the morale phases, score 2 victory points if 1 or more enemy unit fail morale, and if any of those enemy units had 1 or more models destroyed by an attack made by a plague weapon, you would score a total of 3 victory points for that. So again, this is the aspect that can really juice up your point total if you fell behind. We've got a couple of things there. Blight Lords or Death Shroud into multiple squads. You can split your attacks in such a way that you feel confident you can kill at least 1 model. And of course, these units have plague weapons, so they're automatically going to get the additional point if we can force this to happen. So let's say we're up against Tau and we've got a bit of Devilfish Breacher spam. They've yeeted 2 Devilfish up the board. They've thrown 2 squads of Breachers at us. We've been able to make a charge in such a way that we've been able to get in range of both units. We declared the charge against both and we've made it. Again, you're not always going to get to do that, but I'm looking for the scenario where it'll occur. So we've got, say, 4 Death Shroud here. We might split the champion into 1 squad and the other 3 into the other. We're expecting to get a kill with the champion into the 1 squad, and then the other guys hopefully killing 3, 4, 5, 6 models maybe. So the guy on his own that went into the single squad, we can use a 1 CP stratagem to inflict -4 leadership for this morale phase on them. And then the other squad lost more models and are more likely to fail it of their own accord. Now, you won't get a double set of points if they both fail. It's just the first unit that fails per morale phase will score you some points. But having multiple bites at the cherry does 2 things. Firstly, it massively improves your odds. If your opponent's got a 3-up and a 4-up, that's way more likely to come off than just a single 4-up. But also, your opponent can only auto-pass morale with their stratagem once. So by having 2 units in a position to fail morale, they can't avoid it entirely even by spending CP. So that stratagem now is a lot more viable to use because Fleeing Vectors is a far better secondary than it used to be for just forcing to fail morale. So I think if you go in with a Death Shroud or Blight Lord heavy list, maybe a Plague Marine heavy list, this can all be very good. Bloat drones are incredible for chewing through infantry with the Flesh Mower. A couple of bloat drones in a list, and you're going to be looking very nice to score 2 points on the model kills per turn. Something like a Plagueburst Crawler. It's got the entropy cannons to maybe take out a big model. Yes, it only counts as one model kill, but they are plague weapons. Particularly if you've got a few Plagueburst Crawlers, that firepower, whilst it is swingy, it's only 2 shots and they're on 3s at full bracket. If you've got 3 Plagueburst Crawlers shooting at the same target, the odds that that target survives do go down quite considerably. You've also got the 3 mortars there if you are running 3, and a lot of lists do run 3 Plagueburst Crawlers. The 3 mortars, even out of line of sight, 3d6 shots with blast against, perhaps a 10-man infantry squad is going to get some work done. Even with out of line of sight, it reduces the AP effectively because it gives your opponent a better save. Against Armour of Contempt, it's basically at no AP, but otherwise, you've still got the chance of getting a little bit of AP on it. And at flat damage 2, it is very good into a variety of infantry. It's strength 8 as well, so it's getting a good wound roll and a plague weapon to reroll 1s. So it can be a very consistent weapon, even out of line of sight, if you've got multiple Plagueburst Crawlers. If you've only got the 1, it can be swingy. When you get the big 6 shots, it's going to feel really nice. But when you roll a 1 and it's not a blastable target, it's going to suck. So for me, if I do run Plagueburst Crawlers, I tend to run them in at least like 2 or 3. And the idea isn't so much that they work independently. The idea is that they group up on targets and they sort of add consistency to themselves by just being more numerous. And to be honest, I don't think you can go wrong with 2 Plagueburst Crawlers. It's not that big of an investment. 290 points for some significant shooting that the rest of your army can't do does give you a bit of game against armies that want to be a bit more cagey and hide out of line of sight. But it also works really well for Fleeing Vectors because both the mortar and the entropy cannons are plague weapons. And again, a couple of good mortar volleys can be enough to put a unit in a position to fail morale. So if you've done that to their unit on the back objective, they're not going to want to use that. Maybe that's forcing them to auto-pass morale. And then the guys that they threw up to trade with you on the central objective, they're going to be the ones that you go -4 leadership. You are only passing on a 1, sir. Please don't roll a 1. So yeah, that can be a really, really good reason to take Fleeing Vectors if you're building the list with some heavy hitters in melee and some ranged options for the Plagueburst Crawlers. The last one here is Spread the Sickness. Spread the Sickness is, in my opinion, an auto take. It's the only action that your Poxwalkers can do, but they do it very well. So one Death Guard infantry unit from your army can start to perform this action at the end of the movement phase if it's within range of the objective marker that has not been contaminated by your army. It is an action, so you can't advance onto the objective, you have to just move onto it. The action's completed at the end of the turn, so your opponent can't do anything about it. It doesn't happen in your next command phase, it happens at the end of the turn. So if you're declaring it, most of the time you've scored those points, that's it. Sorry there, the dog went a bit mad, so I had to go and sort that out. So it completes at the end of the turn, so your opponent can't interact with it. If completed, the unit that performed the action... if completed, if the unit that performed the action has the objective secured ability, the objective marker is said to be contaminated. So if you do it with Poxwalkers, Plague Marines, Death Shroud, or Blight Lords, it just happens. And most of the time, that is the sort of unit you'll be doing it on. Where possible, you'll use Poxwalkers, because scoring some amount of victory points, you either get 3 or 4 per action on a cheap 50-point 10 squad of Poxwalkers, that's very good value. So if the unit is not objective secured, so let's say you do it with a character, they roll a d6 and they have a 4-up chance, so they've got a 50-50 chance of doing it if they're not OBSEC. Sometimes it'll be worth taking a punt on that. It may be the case that you're there with a character and some Death Shroud, and you go, the Death Shroud really need to shoot and attempt to make a charge. I've still got some character blocking here in the form of some Poxwalkers nearby. They're a bit further away. It's too big a charge for them, and they're not on the objective marker. They can't get in range. They are in range to provide the lookout, sir, but not to get on the objective. I'll just give it a go with the Malignant Plaguecaster, and you've got a 50-50 chance of getting it. So you score 3 victory points for the objective marker in your deployment zone. Not every map has an objective marker in the deployment zone, but that's fine. You get 4 victory points for the objective markers outside your deployment zone. So you only need to get 4 objectives. 3 for the one in your deployment zone, and 12 for the other 3 that are outside your deployment zone, gets you the maximum 15. So you do want to be doing this action every turn for 4 turns. Realistically, you can afford a turn off, but I try and complete them. The first turn, I will try and get to an objective, whether it requires an advance or not, fair enough. But I will try and get to an objective with 1 squad of Poxwalkers in the outfield. Some objectives, it will be achievable on just a move. Others, you will need an advance to get to it. So if it's an advance, I'm going to do my home objective with a squad of 10 Poxwalkers on the home objective. That's exactly why I brought them. And then we've got another squad of 10 that have pushed up. If they got in range, I would do the outfield objective first, because the home field objective is most likely going to be happening turn 2 or turn 3. And whilst the opponent could look to strike in, as long as you're screening out well enough, that shouldn't put you on too much pressure to do it by turn 2. If you're feeling under pressure, you just do that one next. If they kill that squad afterwards, doesn't really matter too much. If you have got something like Plague Burst in support on your deployment zone, that can dissuade your opponent throwing up something that, like a light vehicle with a bit of shooting. It'll do well into the Poxwalkers, but the Plague Burst will do well into it. That can be a bit of a dissuading factor. From there, I'm running a triple drop pod list at the minute, so getting onto objective turn 1 is sort of the point. But besides that, you can start Blight Lords on the board, and you can generally advance them with a good advance. Generally a 4 up, if not a 5 up, to get them onto the central objective by turn 1. And then turn 2, they can just shuffle up a little bit and then do that action if you want. If you've got some good targets for the ranged options on that Blight Lord squad, you might not want to do it turn 2. It is often far more important to get some kills in early, just to make sure your opponent isn't using those models later turns in the game. So if I'm going to take a turn off, it's generally turn 2 or 3. And that's generally because Poxwalkers cannot get that done. So it might be that we've done the home objective and one that the other squad of Poxwalkers could get onto, and then they're going to try and make an advance across to the central objective to get that hit by turn 4. But if that's not the case, and I'm confident my Blight Lords or Death Shroud or whoever's on the central objective can have a go at it, maybe even a character, you maybe even take the punt, the character will take a 50-50 now. That's fine as well. And then you would if you don't get that 50-50, you would put yourself on the position that you must achieve it turn 4 and turn 5. So you just take the lesser of 2 evils, right? These Death Shroud aren't charging this turn, but I'm getting 4 victory points. And if you want to come at them, they're actually a really good Overwatcher, the Death Shroud, if it's a big squad. Same goes with the Foul Blight Spawn, but you don't really want him to get charged. The Death Shroud giving up a turn is probably reasonable, as long as they didn't have like a really easy charge. If they did, then you would probably want to kill some units even on turn 4, because you might lose out on 4 points on Spread the Sickness, but you might still be able to score another 2 to 5 on Fleeing Vectors. And if that's what's occurring, maybe you've got some CP spare to use the -4 leadership. Again, that can be more relevant. So it does depend on the time and the place for the last couple of rounds, but I think for your first 2 turns, you should always be looking to score either an outfield, then your home, or your home, then an outfield objective with a cheap squad, be it Poxwalkers or just 5 Plague Marines. Well, that's it for the secondaries for the Death Guard. I will say, if I'm not taking Despoiled Grounds, which I have been for the past 5 games just to try it out, if I'm not taking that, I think Psychic Interrogation's not a bad pick. It's essentially a spell. It's an action that occurs in the Psychic phase. So you give up one of your casts to attempt this instead. Casts on a 4, so it's pretty consistent to get it off. You score 3 victory points each time you complete the action. One Psychic character from your army can attempt this to perform this psychic action if, in your psychic phase, it is within 24 inch of an enemy character. In addition, if the result of the psychic test is equal or greater to the leadership of any enemy character that is within 24 inch, so you don't have to specifically declare it's this character I'm doing it on. It's just you can do it if there are characters within range. If you roll above the leadership of any of those characters, you get 1 command point in addition. I quite often like to spend 3 to 6 command points before the game. So having that as an option to regain command points when you don't have the Tallyman in the list isn't terrible. As well, if it is on a Malignant Plaguecaster that you're doing this, they might dish out a Mortal Wound for a good roll as well, to the nearest unit within 12. So yeah, if I'm not taking Despoiled Grounds, Psychic Interrogation is definitely a consideration. I don't think Behind Enemy Lines and Engage on All Fronts are better than Despoiled Grounds. I can see there being a use case for it, specific lists, against specific opponents you might want it, but I don't think it's generally better. Grind Them Down isn't a bad shout, particularly if you're going for like really, really tough units, like a lot of Terminators, a lot of Demon Engines. Killing one enemy unit and not losing a full unit of your own isn't necessarily that difficult. So you might want Grind Them Down over Fleeing Vectors. But you basically never take a different action because you just can't complete them with Poxwalkers. And then otherwise, like, Bring It Down could be a good pick instead of Fleeing Vectors. You know, like, if you're coming up against Knights or something, you're never taking Fleeing Vectors. So something like, let's say we're coming up against Knights, I would be taking Bring It Down, Psychic Interrogation, and Spread the Sickness. So you've got a couple of options there for the armies that you don't have a good game on the Death Guard secondaries with. But when you're coming up against just a typical list, just a battalion, it's got some infantry, it's got some vehicles, Fleeing Vectors can be very nice as well. So that's everything I wanted to cover. A bit of a longer video than I'd intended, bit of a ramble, but there's a lot to cover. Hope you enjoyed that. If you did, I'd really appreciate if you get involved in the comments, whether it's a like, a comment, a sub. You know it helps me out, so thank you very much for doing that. I really do appreciate it. But otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time in the Underhive.